November 1947. Takahama Elementary School, Hiroshima Prefecture, Japan. The pencil slipped from Principal Fumiko Nakamura's trembling fingers as she stared at the document that had just arrived from the Allied Occupation Headquarters. Request approved. Roof repair materials allocated. Construction team dispatched. Estimated completion 3 weeks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She read it again, certain she had misunderstood. For 18 months since the war ended, she had submitted 17 formal requests for roof repairs through proper Japanese administrative channels, 17 denials. The Ministry of Education had no funds. The prefecture had no materials. The city had no workers. The building had survived the war structurally intact, they said. A leaking roof was not a priority when thousands lived in makeshift shelters. Through her office window, Fumiko watched rain drip through holes in the ceiling of Classroom 3, forming puddles that her teachers mopped between lessons. Students shifted their wooden desks to avoid the leaks, a daily ritual that had become so routine the children treated it like a game. But it wasn't a game. It was humiliation. It was watching her school slowly rot while she filled out forms that disappeared into bureaucratic silence. The American military government had approved her request in 4 days. 4 days. She had submitted it almost as a formality, expecting the same rejection she received from her own government. Instead, this impossibly swift response arrived with detailed specifications: 12 tons of roofing tiles, 8 tons of lumber, waterproofing materials, nails, brackets, tools, a construction supervisor and 8-person crew, transportation provided, no cost to the school. Fumiko had taught for 23 years before becoming principal in 1945. She remembered when this school had been beautiful, when the government allocated resources generously to education, when repair requests were processed within weeks. That world had ended in August 1945, replaced by one where she begged for chalk and watched rain destroy her classrooms while officials explained that reconstruction priorities lay elsewhere. The other teachers gathered in her office as word spread. Vice Principal Keiko Tanaka, who had lost her husband at Okinawa, read the document with the same disbelief Fumiko felt. Mathematics teacher Haruka Yoshida, whose classroom had 3 separate leaks, actually laughed, a sound Fumiko hadn't heard from her in 2 years. English teacher Yuki Matsumoto, who had studied in California before the war and spoke the conqueror's language, translated every word carefully, making sure they understood correctly. It was real. The Americans were coming to fix their roof, not because they had to, not because of some strategic military purpose, simply because a school had asked for help, and they had the materials to provide it. This casual generosity felt more incomprehensible than defeat itself. Fumiko had expected occupation to mean requisition and control. American forces had indeed commandeered the best buildings in every city. They had imposed new curricula, banned certain textbooks, and supervised everything with bureaucratic thoroughness. But this, sending construction crews to repair a school roof that served no American interest, aligned no military objective, contradicted everything she thought she understood about conquerors. The next morning, 3 American military trucks arrived at 7:30 precisely on schedule. Fumiko stood in the school courtyard with her entire teaching staff, 12 women in worn clothes that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. They had dressed in their best, which meant cleanest, which meant most carefully patched. Beside them stood 247 students ages 6 to 12, silent and uncertain. A tall American soldier stepped down from the lead truck. He removed his cap, revealing red hair that caught the morning sun, and approached Fumiko with a smile that seemed somehow nervous. He bowed, a clumsy attempt at Japanese etiquette that made several students giggle before teachers silenced them with sharp looks. Then he extended his hand for a handshake, Western style, seemingly unsure which greeting was appropriate. Fumiko bowed in return, then shook his hand. His palm was rough with calluses, A working man's hand, not an officer's. He spoke in English, words tumbling out quickly, and Yuki stepped forward to translate. His name was Sergeant James McCarthy from Boston, Massachusetts. He was a construction supervisor in the Army Corps of Engineers. He and his team were here to repair the school roof. They would work from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. They would try to minimize disruption to classes. He apologized in advance for any noise. He hoped the children would forgive them for being loud. The American sergeant was apologizing to them, to Japanese teachers and students, for potential noise while repairing their building for free. Fumiko felt something crack inside her chest, some wall she had built to survive the previous 2 years. 8 more soldiers emerged from the trucks. They began unloading materials with efficient precision, stacking tiles carefully, organizing lumber by size, setting up sawhorses and tool stations. They moved like men who had done this work many times before, who knew their tasks without discussion. But they also paused frequently to smile at curious students, to wave at watching teachers, to bow awkwardly in attempted politeness.
Story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. One soldier, a young man who looked barely 20, pulled candy from his pocket and offered it to a group of first-grade students. The children looked at Fumiko for permission. She nodded, and they accepted with careful bows, clutching the wrapped sweets like treasures. The soldier's face transformed with a smile so genuine it hurt to witness. He missed his own children, Fumiko realized, or his younger siblings. He saw these Japanese students not as enemy children, but simply as children. By mid-morning, the Americans had scaffolding erected and were removing damaged tiles from the worst sections. Sergeant McCarthy walked the entire roof first, marking problem areas with chalk, photographing damage, taking notes in a small book. He was thorough, professional. He treated this school repair with the same seriousness Japanese craftsmen once brought to temple restoration. Fumiko watched from her office window as rain began to fall, a light drizzle that would have sent students scrambling to move desks in classroom 3. Instead, the Americans had already covered that section with canvas tarps, waterproofing the workspace before beginning repairs. They had anticipated the rain. They had planned for it. They were protecting her school from water damage while they worked. The contrast haunted her. For 18 months, she had watched helplessly as rain damaged her building. Japanese bureaucrats had explained endlessly why nothing could be done. Resources were scarce. Priorities were elsewhere. The school would have to wait. Be patient. Understand the difficult circumstances. These Americans had arrived with 12 tons of materials and fixed the problem in hours. Not because they were ordered to help, not because they gained anything from it, simply because they could, and someone had asked, and they believed schools deserved roofs that didn't leak. During lunch break, students clustered at windows watching the Americans work. The soldiers ate sandwiches on the scaffolding, massive portions of bread and meat that made Fumiko's own rice ball lunch seem pitifully small. But when students approached shyly, the Americans broke their sandwiches in half and shared them, sitting cross-legged on the ground with children who had been taught just 2 years ago that these men were demons. One soldier pulled out photographs from his wallet, showing them to a group of 5th-grade boys. His family, Yuki translated, his wife and 2 daughters back in Ohio. He missed them terribly. He hoped to go home soon, but meanwhile he was glad to help repair their school. His daughters were about the same age as these students. He wanted all children to have good schools with roofs that didn't leak. Vice Principal Keiko watched this exchange with tears streaming down her face. Her husband had died fighting these men. She had every reason to hate them. Instead, she was watching an enemy soldier share his lunch with Japanese children and show them pictures of his family. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. By the end of the first day, the Americans had removed all damaged tiles from the east wing and begun laying new ones. The work was precise, careful, and fast. Sergeant McCarthy inspected everything personally, running his hand over each section, checking alignment, ensuring quality. He rejected 2 sections that his own team had completed, making them redo the work to higher standards. He was demanding perfection for a Japanese elementary school. As the soldiers prepared to leave, Fumiko approached Sergeant McCarthy with Yuki translating. She thanked him formally, bowing deeply. She tried to express what this meant to her school, to her teachers, to her students. Words felt inadequate. How do you thank someone for restoring not just a roof, but a sense that the world contained kindness? McCarthy looked uncomfortable with the praise. Through Yuki, he explained that it was just a roof. They had materials, they had skills. Using them to help schools made sense. Children needed safe buildings to learn in. That seemed obvious to him, not worthy of excessive gratitude, just normal human decency. That phrase, translated carefully by Yuki, struck Fumiko like a physical blow. Normal human decency. As if helping others was simply what people did. As if generosity required no special virtue, no extraordinary effort. As if abundance meant you helped those with less automatically, without needing praise or recognition. The second day brought more progress. The Americans worked through intermittent rain, unbothered by weather that would have halted Japanese construction crews lacking proper equipment. They had waterproof clothing, modern tools, and seemingly unlimited materials. When they needed more nails, a truck brought them. When they required additional lumber, it arrived within an hour. The logistics were casual, effortless, as if resources simply appeared when needed. Fumiko began to understand something profound about the war her country had lost. Japan had mobilized every citizen for total war effort. Students had stopped attending school to work in factories. Teachers had been drafted. Resources had been rationed to starvation levels. The entire nation had sacrificed everything, and still they had lost. These Americans worked regular hours, with lunch breaks. They laughed while they worked. They had enough
materials to waste them. They operated with the casual confidence that came from knowing shortages were temporary inconveniences, not existential threats. They had fought a global war while maintaining such surplus that they could now repair enemy schools as an afterthought. Mathematics teacher Haruka approached Fumiko during afternoon recess. She had been calculating. The materials the Americans brought, if purchased through black market channels, would cost more than 5 years of the school's entire budget. The labor would cost even more. This gift represented resources beyond anything their prefecture could allocate to a single school, yet the Americans treated it as routine. Just another project, nothing special, standard occupation assistance, as if every conquering army in history naturally repaired enemy infrastructure from surplus abundance, as if this was simply what nations with resources did. By the third day, students had overcome their initial shyness. They clustered around the Americans during breaks, asking questions through Yuki's translation. Where was America? How big were American schools? Did American children study the same subjects? The soldiers answered patiently, pulling out maps to show their hometowns, describing their own school experiences, treating enemy children with gentle kindness that seemed as natural to them as breathing. One student, a fourth-grade girl named Achiko, whose father had died at Iwo Jima, asked the question that haunted everyone. "Why are you helping us? You fought our fathers. Some of you probably killed people we loved. Why would you fix our school?" Sergeant McCarthy listened to the translation, then sat down on the scaffolding so he was at eye level with the children. He thought for a long moment before answering. Through Yuki, he explained that war was over. Fighting was finished. Now came the work of building a better world. That meant helping children have good schools, regardless of which country they were born in. His country had resources, this school needed a roof. Connecting those two facts seemed simple to him. But it wasn't simple. Fumiko knew history. Conquerors took, they didn't give. They extracted resources from defeated enemies. They didn't donate materials freely. Throughout human history, victory meant plunder, not charity. These Americans were doing something unprecedented, and they didn't even seem to realize how extraordinary it was. The English teacher, Yuki, had her own perspective. She had studied in California before the war, had American friends, had loved American literature and music. When war began, she had been forced to renounce those connections, to teach English as the language of demons.
Now those demons were repairing her school with casual generosity that matched everything she had loved about American culture before propaganda poisoned it. She pulled Fumiko aside during lunch on the fourth day. She had been talking extensively with the soldiers in English without translating everything for the other teachers. She had learned things that she thought Fumiko needed to understand. These men weren't special. They weren't selected for unusual kindness. They were ordinary soldiers doing routine occupation duty. This level of helpfulness was normal for them, standard procedure. The American military government had programs to repair hundreds of schools across Japan, thousands of infrastructure projects. They were rebuilding the country they had just finished destroying, not slowly, not grudgingly, but with the same industrial efficiency they had applied to warfare. They were as good at building as they had been at bombing. Fumiko felt dizzy trying to comprehend the scale. Not just her school, hundreds of schools. Her roof was not some exceptional act of mercy. It was routine, standard occupation policy. They were repairing Japan with the same abundance they had used to fight Japan. The surplus that had overwhelmed Japanese forces was now overwhelming Japanese reconstruction needs. By the end of the first week, the entire East Wing had a new roof. The Americans had worked faster than any Japanese crew could have managed, with better materials, higher quality, and cheerful efficiency. They took pride in their work. Sergeant McCarthy walked Fumiko through the completed sections, explaining what they had done, showing her how the new tiles overlapped, how the waterproofing worked, how long it should last. 30 years minimum, he estimated, longer with minimum maintenance. 30 years. He was building for a future he would never see, in a country he would leave, for children who were not his own. The long-term thinking, the quality commitment, the generous care for people he would never meet again, it represented something deeper than kindness. It represented a worldview where helping others was simply what capable people did. The second week brought unexpected complications that revealed even more about these Americans. Heavy rains arrived, the kind that turned roads to mud and halted most construction. Japanese workers would have stopped, waited for better weather, accepted the delay as inevitable. The Americans adapted. They erected additional tarps, creating covered work areas. They brought portable heaters to dry materials. They adjusted their schedule but never stopped working. Problems were obstacles to solve, not reasons to quit. Fumiko watched this determination with growing understanding. This was how America had won the war, not just through superior resources, but through a mindset that treated challenges as temporary inconveniences rather than insurmountable barriers. When rain came, they built shelter. When materials ran short, they requisitioned more. When techniques didn't work, they invented new ones. They approached problems with confidence that solutions existed if you just kept trying. One morning, a severe leak appeared in the main hallway ceiling that hadn't been on the original repair list. Water poured through, flooding the floor where students walked between classes. Fumiko saw it during morning inspection and felt the familiar helplessness return. This wasn't part of the approved repair. She would need to submit a new request, wait for approval, explain the emergency. Weeks would pass while water damaged the building. Sergeant McCarthy saw it during his morning arrival. He climbed into the ceiling space immediately, flashlight in hand, tracing the leak to its source. A broken support beam had shifted, creating new gaps. He called up 2 of his team members. Within an hour, they had materials brought in. By lunch, they were installing reinforcements. By evening, the leak was fixed, the ceiling repaired, the floor dried. No forms, no requests, no bureaucratic process, just a problem identified and solved. When Fumiko tried to thank him, McCarthy seemed confused about what she was thanking him for. The leak was obvious, fixing it was obvious. Why would they ignore a problem they could solve? His genuine bewilderment at her gratitude revealed how differently their minds worked. He saw need and responded. She saw need and reached for paperwork. The students began bringing the soldiers small gifts, hand-drawn pictures, origami cranes, carefully wrapped rice balls from their own meager lunches. The Americans accepted each gift with solemn ceremony, treating childish artwork like precious treasures.
Several soldiers kept the drawings in their pockets. One man had tears in his eyes receiving an origami crane from a tiny first grader who could barely reach his knee. These gestures of childhood innocence seemed to affect the soldiers deeply. They were young men, far from home, occupying a country they had fought bitterly. These children's fathers and older brothers had tried to kill them. They had killed Japanese soldiers in return. Yet here were children offering them rice balls and paper crayons, and the soldiers treasured these gifts like holy relics. Vice Principal Keiko began talking to Fumiko late one evening after the soldiers had left. She had been wrestling with impossible emotions. Her hatred for Americans had sustained her through grief after her husband's death. That hatred had given shape to her pain, purpose to her suffering. These soldiers were destroying that hatred by being kind, and she didn't know how to process the loss of her anger. She watched them work with patience and skill. She saw them smile at students with genuine warmth. She heard them laugh together with easy camaraderie. They were not monsters. They were not demons. They were ordinary men doing good work competently and cheerfully. Her husband had died fighting ordinary men who laughed and smiled and treated children kindly. The complexity of that reality was almost unbearable. Fumiko understood. She had her own contradictions to navigate. The government that had led Japan to war had abandoned her school. The enemy that had destroyed Japanese cities was repairing her roof. The people she had been taught to hate were showing more care for Japanese children than Japanese bureaucrats had managed. Every assumption about good and evil, about us and them, about victor and vanquished, was being challenged by the simple act of Americans fixing a roof. By the third week, the work was nearly complete. The Americans had repaired not just the roof, but also structural damage they discovered during the work. Support beams, floor joists, window frames, wall cracks. They fixed everything they found without being asked. Sergeant McCarthy seemed personally offended by shoddy construction or deferred maintenance. He wanted this school perfect. One afternoon, he pulled Fumiko aside for a conversation that Yuki translated with visible emotion. He had found significant damage in the school's foundation. Water had been seeping in for years, slowly undermining the structural integrity. If left unrepaired, the building might become unsafe within 5 years. He wanted permission to fix it. It would require additional time and materials, but he could requisition what was needed. He couldn't leave knowing the building was compromised. Fumiko stood silently, absorbing this information. The foundation damage was invisible. No one would have known about it. McCarthy could have completed the roof repair and left with everyone praising his work. Instead, he was volunteering to do unrequested additional work that would delay his departure, require more resources, and benefit only people he would never see again. She asked him why. Why go beyond the assignment? Why take on extra burden? Why care so much about a Japanese school that meant nothing to his military career? McCarthy looked uncomfortable with the question.
With the thoroughness of someone building a cathedral, his team worked in the muddy crawl space beneath the school, with the same careful attention they had given the visible roof. No one would see this work. It existed only to keep children safe. That was sufficient motivation. During this final week, something shifted in the relationship between soldiers and teachers. The Americans had been polite but somewhat distant at first, professional and careful. Now they relaxed. They joked with teachers. They learned a few Japanese phrases. They asked about students' lives and teachers' experiences. The barrier of recent enmity dissolved into simple human connection. One soldier, named Robert, had been a teacher before the war. He taught mathematics at a high school in Philadelphia. He talked with Haruka about teaching methods, comparing American and Japanese approaches. They discovered they faced similar challenges, used similar techniques, and shared the same frustrations with students who didn't complete homework. War had made them enemies. Teaching made them colleagues. Another soldier, named Thomas, had studied Japanese art before being drafted.
He spent his lunch breaks in the school's small library, carefully examining the damaged books, asking questions about Japanese literature and history. Yuki brought him tea, and they discussed poetry, finding common ground in shared love of beautiful language. He had bombed Japanese cities. She had lost friends in those bombings. Now they discussed haiku and found mutual understanding in 17 syllables. These personal connections multiplied across the 3 weeks. Every soldier found some point of human commonality with teachers or students. They were not just occupiers and occupied. They were people with families, interests, dreams, fears, and shared humanity that transcended national boundaries. On the final day, the entire school gathered for an informal ceremony. The Americans had completed everything: new roof, repaired foundation, fixed walls, replaced windows. The building was sounder than it had been before the war. Sergeant McCarthy and his team stood in the courtyard, looking slightly embarrassed, while Fumiko gave a speech that Yuki translated. She thanked them for their work. She thanked them for their kindness. She thanked them for showing her students that former enemies could become friends. She thanked them for demonstrating that strength included gentleness, that power included generosity, and that victory included mercy. She thanked them for giving hope to people who had forgotten what hope felt like. The students sang a traditional Japanese song of gratitude. Their young voices carried across the courtyard, pure and sincere. Several soldiers openly cried. McCarthy stood at attention, with tears streaming down his face, while Japanese children sang to thank American soldiers for fixing their school. The moment held all the complexity and contradiction and unexpected grace of people trying to build peace from the ruins of war. Afterward, the soldiers packed their equipment. Students clustered around them, reluctant to let them leave. The men handed out their remaining candy, signed autographs, accepted final drawings and origami cranes. They took photographs, promising to send copies to the school. They shook hands with every teacher, bowing awkwardly, trying to express in gestures what language barriers prevented them from saying. As the trucks prepared to depart, a first-grade student named Hiroshi broke from the group and ran to Sergeant McCarthy. He wrapped his small arms around the soldier's leg and wouldn't let go. His father had died in the war. He had learned to hate Americans. Now he was hugging one and crying because the soldier was leaving. McCarthy knelt down and hugged the child properly. He spoke softly in English, words Hiroshi couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear in tone and gesture. Comfort, affection, promise that everything would be all right. When he finally stood, he kept his hand on Hiroshi's head for a long moment, a benediction of sorts, before climbing into the truck. The convoy drove away slowly. Students and teachers lined the road waving. The soldiers waved back until they disappeared from sight. The schoolyard felt empty without them. For 3 weeks, these men had been part of their daily rhythm. Now they were gone, leaving behind a repaired building and transformed hearts. Fumiko returned to her office and sat at her desk in silence. The roof above her was solid. No leaks, no drips, no water damage. But the greater repair was internal. These Americans had fixed something in her that had been broken since the war ended. They had restored her faith that goodness existed, that people could be trusted, that the world contained more kindness than cruelty. She thought about what this meant for her students. They had watched enemy soldiers work with dedication and skill. They had received kindness from people they had been taught to fear. They had learned that nationality mattered less than character, that yesterday's enemies could be today's friends, and that peace was possible when people chose compassion over vengeance. The lesson was more valuable than any curriculum she could teach. Her students had witnessed practical forgiveness. They had experienced grace in action. They had seen that the strong could choose to help rather than harm, that victors could choose to build rather than destroy, and that abundance meant responsibility to share rather than opportunity to hoard.
In weeks, other schools in the prefecture reported similar experiences. American teams repairing buildings, improving facilities, providing materials. What happened at Takahama was not unique. It was part of a massive reconstruction effort that treated former enemies with unexpected generosity. The Americans were rebuilding Japan with the same efficiency they had used to defeat Japan. Teachers from other schools visited Fumiko to see the repairs and hear about the experience. She showed them the solid roof, the reinforced foundation, and the careful workmanship. But mostly she told them about Sergeant McCarthy, about soldiers who shared their lunch, about men who cried when children sang, and about the profound gift of being helped by people who owed you nothing but gave everything. Word spread through the community. Parents came to see the repaired school. They marveled at the quality of work, the donated materials, and the free labor. Many had their own stories of American generosity: food distributions, medical care, assistance with housing. The occupation they had dreaded was proving unexpectedly humane. This collective experience began shifting public consciousness. The propaganda they had believed about American barbarism dissolved in the face of repeated acts of kindness. The hatred that had sustained them through war seemed increasingly absurd when confronted with soldiers fixing school roofs and sharing candy with children. Fumiko watched this transformation in her own staff. Keiko, who had lost her husband, began teaching her students that peace was possible. Haruka incorporated examples of American generosity into her mathematics lessons, calculating tons of donated materials and man-hours of free labor. Yuki taught English with renewed passion, seeing the language as a bridge rather than a weapon. The students changed most dramatically. They had lived through war as young children, absorbing adult hatred and fear. Now they experienced peace through the actions of kind soldiers. They learned that enemies could become friends, that strangers could become helpers, and that nationality was less important than character. These lessons would shape them throughout their lives. Years later, Fumiko would attend reunions where her former students, now adults, spoke about the Americans who fixed their school. They remembered soldiers' names, their faces, their kindness. That 3-week period in 1947 had imprinted itself on their young minds as proof that goodness existed, that people could be trusted, and that the world held more light than darkness. The school building stood solid for exactly as long as Sergeant McCarthy predicted, 32 years before requiring major renovation. Multiple generations of students learned beneath that roof. Every principal who followed Fumiko knew the story of how Americans had repaired it. The tale became part of school identity, a founding myth of sorts, about how kindness from unexpected sources had saved them. Fumiko never saw Sergeant McCarthy again. She wrote him letters through military mail forwarding services but never received replies. She didn't know if the letters reached him or if he had returned to civilian life and lost touch with military channels. But she thought of him often, especially during rain, when the roof he built kept her students dry and safe. She retired in 1965 after 40 years of teaching. Her final speech as principal told the story of the American soldiers one more time. She wanted her students to remember that the strong have choices. They can oppress or uplift, harm or heal, take or give. The Americans who fixed their school had chosen generosity when they could have chosen indifference. That choice made all the difference. The story of Takahama Elementary School represented thousands of similar stories across post-war Japan. Americans repairing what Americans had destroyed. Former enemies becoming friends. Conquerors becoming builders. It was unprecedented in human history, this generous occupation, this martial plan that rebuilt enemies rather than extracting tribute from them.
Japanese teachers like Fumiko, who experienced this generosity firsthand, understood something profound. They had fought a war of scarcity against a war of abundance. They had lost because their enemies had more of everything. But in peace, that abundance became blessing rather than curse. The surplus that had overwhelmed them militarily now rebuilt them materially and spiritually. The roof over Classroom 3 never leaked again in Fumiko's lifetime. Every time it rained, she remembered Sergeant McCarthy inspecting tiles, demanding perfection, building for a future he would never see. She remembered soldiers sharing their lunch with hungry children. She remembered men who cried at children's songs and treasured paper cranes like gold. These memories sustained her through difficult years of reconstruction and transformation. When challenges seemed overwhelming, she thought of Americans working cheerfully in rain. When resources seemed inadequate, she remembered 12 tons of materials arriving because someone asked. When human kindness seemed
Impossible, she pictured soldiers hugging children whose fathers they might have killed. The Americans who fixed Takahama Elementary School's roof never knew the profound impact of their work. To them, it was routine occupation duty, standard reconstruction assistance, nothing special or extraordinary. They moved on to other projects, other schools, other tasks. They probably forgot about the small school in Hiroshima Prefecture where they spent 3 weeks in 1947. But the Japanese teachers and students never forgot. They carried those 3 weeks like treasures. Proof that darkness could give way to light, that enemies could become friends, and that peace was possible when people chose compassion over cruelty. The Americans had given them more than a roof. They had given them hope, restored their faith in humanity, and demonstrated that the world still contained kindness even after the worst war in human history. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.